Laura Baines right here on France 24. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. This is the France 24 debate. On the day when there are high-powered delegations in Paris to discuss Libya, we're looking at Gaddafi's ghost, the spillover effect of lawlessness that continues 2 years after his ouster. With us to talk about it from Oxford, former UK ambassador to Libya, Oliver Miles. William Jordan, former U.S. State Department Director of the Maghreb office there. Journalist and researcher at London-based think tank Chatham House, Paul MELLY. And from New Haven, Connecticut, visiting scholar Radidja Menar. Welcome back to all of you. Before the break, we were asking, is Libya the weakest link when it comes as not just as an entry point for jihadists and weapons, but also for illegal migrants heading north towards Europe? Amongst the decisions that were made this Tuesday was to EU advisors to help Libya's Coast Guard. And again, it's sort of cynical, Oliver Miles, but this is the way in which Libya seems to be grabbing Europe's attention.
Yes, well, just to deal with some of the topics we were talking about before the break, when I said that the changeover in Libya would be a long-term affair, I perhaps used the wrong expression. What I mean is it can't just be done by a government decision, by a stroke of the pen. They've got to work on the problem of reintegrating these fighters into their security forces, and that will take time. But when I say take time, I'm talking about maybe a year or maybe a bit more than a year. And I'm not talking about the very long term. So the impact of Libya is felt through the availability of weapons. Gaddafi had enormous quantities of weapons, and many of them have gone astray. We don't know how many. Secondly, one of the speakers already mentioned that Tuareg were employed by Gaddafi in various capacities, long-term and also more recently during the fight against the revolution. And those have now are no longer being paid by Libya and have disappeared from Libya and are making themselves felt in other parts of the Sahel. And then there's another element which we haven't mentioned so far, which is that there are some people in Libya, I think quite a small minority, but nevertheless important, mainly from Cyrenaica, that's the eastern part of Libya, who are committed jihadis. Many of them are what are called Afghans, that is to say people who fought in Afghanistan, either against the Soviets or against the Americans. Some of them fought in Iraq. I myself think these were probably the people who were responsible for the attack on the American consulate in Benghazi, in which the American ambassador was killed. Of course, the fact that they're a small number doesn't mean that they're not dangerous. They are. Taking the bigger picture, somebody mentioned Libyan investment in sub-Saharan Africa. I don't see why that should cease. Libya has investments and will want to continue to maintain them, and the problem of migration will continue. It existed in the same form under Gaddafi. It's not a political problem, it's a geographical problem, and it's very, very difficult to know how to deal with it. And Libya will have to work with Europeans, and Europeans will have to work with Libyans to find an answer to it. And as long as the conditions south of the Sahara are as terrible as they are, it will be very difficult to control it.
William Jordan, the current government in Libya says, we heard the Prime Minister say that he's working closely with the Americans. How much staying power do they have at this point?
How much
staying power does the current government have, seeing it?
That's very hard to say because for a lot of the reasons that Ambassador Miles has just mentioned, I mean, and I would even go further to say, I do think it will take a long time, probably more than a year, for Libya to sort out many of its problems. I mean, Libya in many ways is finally coming to grips with some of the contradictions that go back to its independence. He mentioned Cyrenaica. I mean, the eastern part of Libya has always had a very strongly distinct and different identity from the western Tripolitania part based around Tripoli. The Gaddafi regime incorporated a lot of what was considered in the east as a suppression of eastern interests for the advantage of those living in Tripoli. This is something that I don't think is on the verge of being taken care of. And it's one of the reasons why you have these weapons still in the hands of these so-called militias, because nobody wants to surrender the weapons to the government at a time when there are still deep cleavages among these different parts of society. How or whether you can easily pull it all together in the immediate future, I don't know. I'm not sure where that leaves us working with the vestiges of what Gaddafi had left over. We had a very close relationship with Gaddafi's security services in particular. It was vital to our counterterrorism strategy in the region. I'm not sure what has come together in the literal rubble of the Gaddafi regime as far as a viable set of partners. I would believe that the people concerned with these in Langley and elsewhere in the U.S. government are very keen to make sure that we set up and are working with valuable partners. But I'm really not sure right now who they are and how trustworthy they are, given the confused political circumstances in Libya.
All right, so Radidja NEMAR, we see several visions of Libya seem to always be popping up on our screens from outside of the country. One is what William Jordan was just describing, where you have different groups in different cities that are looking at each other suspiciously and hanging on to their weapons. And the other, you see a population that's moved to the cities, that is urban. So is it nation building from scratch, or isn't it what's going on in Libya?
Well, nation building can be done on several ways. If you see that the population is going back to the cities, maybe going back to economic activities, it can help nation building. But on the other side, what we know about Gaddafi's way of ruling at his time, it was dividing for a better to rule on the country. So now it's difficult to have united leadership in Libya that is able to launch a real nation building, as, for example, we had in a post-independence war Algeria, where we had an army, a strong organized army. After some struggles within the army, one of the group won and then held to himself all the narrative of the independence and the struggle against colonization, and then served as a basis for nation building. And does the same thing can happen in Libya? I'm not sure, because we have like this several parts looking at each other this way. But I don't think there would be any serious nation building if there is not a common ground between all these militias, or one militias standing against the others and seizing the power and saying we are building the nation, whether alone or with the cooperation of the other factions. But if we still have this struggle between all these parts, then it will be difficult to build a nation from the top.
Oliver Miles, again, what's your prediction on that?
Well, it's difficult to make a prediction on that.
Oliver Miles.
I think that's a little bit pessimistic. I think it overlooks two important factors. One is that we now have in Libya quite a solid democratically elected Congress, and it is addressing just this problem. The main problem that the Libyans see in front of them right now is the question of decentralization. They don't use the word federalism, because federalism has been taken to mean the breakup of the Libyan state, which most people don't want. But they've got to find a way of getting the relationship between the capital and the rest of the country right. And they're serious about it. And they've just, for example, decided in Congress to change the original intention, which was to appoint a 60-man committee who are going to draft the constitution which will address these problems. And instead of appointing the 60-man committee, they've decided that it should be elected by the population. And that is, if you like, a concession, a gesture towards Cyrenaica and the people in Benghazi who want to have a looser structure. But the point I want to get across is not that they've got the answer to this problem, but they know that this is the problem and they are trying to deal with it in a mature and sensible and democratic way. And the second point I'd like to mention very briefly is just that in dealing with all these problems, the fact that they have a lot of money is a great help. If it's a question, for example, of disarming militias, they have to be offered something in return. Libya has cash.
Again, this issue of how Libya comes out has also sparked a diplomatic bit of a spat. Russia's foreign minister a few days ago in Moscow spoke forcefully against the French intervention in Mali, and he quoted Libya.
Yes, the Russians have taken a rather, to my mind, unjustified position on Libya. They made a mistake, to be blunt. They and the Chinese abstained on the Security Council resolutions which authorized the NATO and other activity in Libya, and they've been regretting it ever since and trying to row back from that. But the fact is, they could have vetoed it, and they didn't.
All right, let's listen to Sergei Lavrov now as the statement he made a couple of days ago, and we'll hear the response from this Tuesday from the French foreign minister.
In Mali, France is fighting the same people it armed in Libya in fighting against Gaddafi. This in violation of the embargo imposed by the Security Council. Currently, the French are victoriously marching through Mali, occupying positions already abandoned by the terrorists. But where did these guys go? They will most likely spread out into neighboring countries.
It's true that in the whole region there are a lot of weapons, too many weapons, that come from different places. In the same manner, though, there are way too many weapons in Syria, and we know where they come from.
All right, an allusion there, Paul Melly, to Russia's backing of Syria. But who of the two, Sergei Lavrov or Laurent Fabius, makes the more forceful point?
Well, I think the key point about the Mali situation, which is different from Syria, is that the Arab world has got a more complex and more diverse attitude to the Syrian crisis. So any outside intervention, and indeed the stance of the Chinese and the Russians on the one side vis-à-vis Western governments on the other, is taking place in a context where the region isn't really able to set a clear lead. Whereas in the case of the Mali crisis, the French have intervened in a context where ECOWAS, the main bloc of West African countries to which Mali belongs, has set a clear political mandate. The African Union has set a clear political mandate for how the Mali crisis should be handled, and they've endorsed the intervention, and they'd already given a political green light, in effect, to outside intervention, African-led, late last year. So we're operating in a very different context, I think. I don't think that it really helps for countries to try and catcall, if you like, in making comparisons between the Syrian situation and what's happening in Mali. They're very, very different.
All right, so you're saying immaturity on the part of both of them in this instance. William Jordan, there's another aspect to this, and which is, okay, Ambassador Miles was mentioning the arsenal maybe comes from Gaddafi that we're seeing in places like Mali, but that's not going to last forever. On the other hand, there's the money, which has been flowing, and they're privately at least, French officials have quipped about the money coming from the Gulf states. And the question is, why haven't Western leaders taken a more vocal public stance on this?
In terms of money coming into Libya to help with development?
Into Libya, and also into helping some of these jihadist groups in the Sahel.
Well, I don't have a good answer to you on that. I mean, I think we're probably trying to evaluate those sorts of relationships and ties. I mean, the problems of the Gulf states supporting jihadists was a problem, in fact, in Libya, and it was one of the things that forced the Western intervention into Libya, because Qatar, in particular, was not prepared to just sit on its hands while the situation was unfolding. The brutal suppression of the Libyan people, especially in the east, was unfolding last year. I think there's a lot that I believe is confusing Washington and probably other Western capitals as far as how to deal with Libya in particular, whether it has to do with supporting nation building, whether it has to do with supporting economic reconstruction, or whether it has to do with the role of jihadists and these militias, and that is the very uncertain security situation and the very tortured and difficult efforts the government is making towards trying to get a handle on it. Ambassador Miles is correct, but it is a difficult struggle for the government to get on top of it.
Ambassador Miles, if you want to stop jihadists, do you follow the weapons and go to Libya, or do you follow the money and, in some cases, it seems, go to the Gulf states?
I'm sure you have to follow all those things, but I am nervous about this. I was nervous about the Western intervention in Libya, although in the end I think it was successful and justified. Having said some rather harsh things about the Russians just now, I think the Russians are quite right to be very, very doubtful about foreign intervention, whether it's in Syria or indeed anywhere else. I think you have to be very, very careful to ensure that you don't do more harm than good when you intervene in these ways. I think where it's not just a joke to talk about local government, I think you've got to rely on the local government to determine what its needs are. And I was, having criticised David Cameron also for what he said about the Algerian raid at the beginning, I was glad to see that more recently he's gone back to the language he was using before and saying that what we need to be doing is providing the support that the Libyan and other governments ask for. It's for them to take the initiative. It's for them to solve their problems with our help. If we try to do it behind their backs or over their heads, it won't work.
All right. I want to thank you, Ambassador Miles, for joining us from Oxford in England. I want to thank Radidja NEMAR from joining us from Yale University in Connecticut, Paul MELLY and William Jordan for being with us. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.